It is 9:45. It is right on time, according to my atomic clock. I don't know about this weather, though. It's not right on time. It was supposed to stay like it was last week, but you know. Welcome to Texas. If you don't like the weather, just wait a minute. It'll probably do something different. I noticed from the extended forecast that, come right on in, that supposedly by Monday or so we'll be up in the 70s and 80s for the rest of the week. Yeah. Cute. Oh, wonderful.
Is that a door prize?
I won.
Well, he walked in the door and he got it.
Yeah. It came through the door, and yeah, that's why they call it that. Well, topic today is compost tea. Why would anybody want to make compost tea? Well, we are finding more and more that the most important thing we have in our soil is the microbial life that's in there. If you took a teaspoon of healthy soil, you might find as many as 10,000 different kinds of bacteria, beneficial bacteria. It's possible you'd find as many as 5,000 different kinds of beneficial fungi. In addition, you might very well find a lot of little things that we call protozoans. You might find what we call microarthropods, little miniature insects of the non-damaging variety. You might find beneficial nematodes. There are lots and lots of good things in healthy soil. It has been found, and a lot of this is research done by a really neat lady. Her name is Dr. Elaine Ingham. She's former professor of microbiology up at the University of Oregon, and started discovering all these things, decided that she wanted to do more than just teach, so she formed her own company called the Soil Food Web, devoted to researching and helping farmers and ranchers and commercial growers. She now has offices, I understand, on 5 continents, works all over the world, and had the privilege of taking a course that she taught a few years ago. She came to Austin and put on a course about compost teas and analyzing compost teas and all sorts of good information. But she has shown that healthy plant roots may be colonized up to 4, 5, 6 layers deep with just layers of bacteria which protect the roots from all sorts of problems. Later research has shown that the leaves of the plants, the stems of the plants, virtually the whole plant may very well be covered with bacteria and with beneficial fungi, and these things stop a lot of insect problems. If a leaf is totally covered with beneficial fungi, it's very hard for a damaging fungus, anthracnose or powdery mildew or anything like that, to even get a foothold on the leaf. So this is the kind of life that in nature protects plants from a lot of different insect problems, a lot of different disease problems. There are also forms of fungus, principally what we call mycorrhizal fungi, which tend to form a large network. Their body or their mycelium just extends for many, many yards through the soil, and it's a true symbiotic relationship. It's called an ectomycorrhizal fungus, and the fungus body comes up in real close proximity to the root system of the plant. The fungus is actually living off of carbohydrates that are bled out from the roots. It's estimated now, I think, that something like 30% of the carbohydrate material, the sugar material that a plant produces, is actually lost out through the root system. But this is not an accident, and it's something that's evolved over the years, because it's that material coming out of the root that supports all this beneficial life around the root system. Mycorrhizal fungi, for instance, they estimate increase the effective surface area of the roots, the area over which the roots would be able to absorb things. They increase it by a factor of about 50,000. And these things can spread a large distance through the soil. In return for the carbohydrates that they are getting from the plant, they bring minerals, they bring water and things up in much closer proximity to the roots. And if you've ever noticed driving up and down the interstates and things, all these plantings they do out in the medians, and you never see them watering or anything, that the state discovered this a long time ago, that if you inoculate the root systems with the mycorrhizal fungus, you can really cut back on the amount of water that you have to supply the plant. So anyway, in a nutshell, there are a tremendous number of things out there, things that we can't see, that still benefit the plants, benefit the soils very, very greatly. Other things that the microbes do, they take the fertilizers that we put out and convert them into forms that plants can use. They are the most efficient recyclers of nutrients out there. Plant grows roots, those roots eventually rot. It's the microbes that break those old roots back down into things that plants can absorb and use over and over again. I'm not sure that I completely understand it, but Elaine has said that if you could get an efficient enough recycling going on in the soil, and if we didn't cut off the top of the plants and haul them away for one reason or another, one application of fertilizer could last for 100 years. So that's what the microbial life in the soil is all about. Now, what has happened to the microbial life in a lot of our soils? Well, it's been, to a large degree, eliminated or at least set back very severely by things like chemical fertilizers, by things like pesticides, by over-tillage of the soil, and to some extent, when we have a drought as severe as we've had the past 18 months, we have lost a lot of the life in the soil. Some of the microbes have a resting state. They merely go into a dormant state when it gets real dry or real cold or whatever else. Others simply die out and then come back in whenever the opportunity is there, when the soil gets more moisture in it and the birds bring them back in on their feet and their droppings and things like that. A good healthy soil will have a lot of microbial life in it. Soil that has been over-treated chemically, over-farmed, over-tilled, may be very devoid in a lot of these good things, and we would like to find a good way to put it back. Well, compost has a large amount of microbial life in it, and the more different things that went into making the compost, the greater the variety of the microbial life is in there. That's why I'm not crazy about composts that are made from one specific product only. You hear a lot about cotton burr compost. Well, cotton burr compost is full of the things that break down and recycle the nutrients that are in cotton plants. But that's just a very small number compared to places like Newer Soils and Technology. They incorporate, sometimes as much as 20 or 30 or 40 different things in their compost. I mean, Clayton Leonard that operates that place, Clayton uses literally anything he can find. He's told me he's put old ice cream in it. He's put, slaughterhouse byproducts in there. Just literally almost anything organic will go into that compost. And obviously, the greater the diversity of the material that is being decomposed as it's turned into compost, the wider the variety of the microbes that you have in that compost. That's why in your home compost pile, sure, you can have a compost pile that's nothing but grass and leaves. But if you throw some kitchen scraps in there, if you throw other kinds of organic material in there, in the long run you will probably have better compost. And this really isn't about making compost, but I don't think there's anything wrong with talking a little bit about it to tell you what has gotten into the compost that we're going to be using to make the compost tea. You hear a lot these days about the so-called barreled composters. One of these gimmicks you read in the magazine. You can pay a few $100s and get this little cute thing that tells you you're going to make wonderful compost in 10 days. Well, several things about that. Like the Chamber of Commerce says, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. But the best of the compost, number one, are made with lots of different ingredients. But you would like to have a combination of bacterially derived compost materials and fungally derived materials. Now, when you go out in your compost pile and you start to turn it, you see all that white, moldy threads of stuff going back and forth through the pile. Those are beneficial fungi. Now, some beneficial fungi are tiny, single-cell things. Technically, we call them ascomycetes. They're in the yeast family, and they're little tiny one-celled organisms, not as small as bacteria, but down on that order. But the kind of fungi that break down woody materials, sawdust and twigs and things like that, they may form this mycelium, this body that goes for feet and feet through the compost pile. And when you break that up, you're in effect killing off that fungus. And when you have your little barrel composter and you go out there and you give it this, you're in effect wiping out most of the beneficial fungus that's in there, and you're getting an almost 100% bacterial compost. Is it good? Sure, it's good. There's no such thing as bad compost. But if you want the very best of compost, then you do what we call the static pile method, where it sits for an extended period of time between turnings, and this allows you to develop lots of different kinds of fungi. So why would we want to make compost tea as opposed to compost? Well, if you have acres of gardens or acres and acres of pasture and things like that, unless you've recently won the lottery, you can't afford enough compost to go out and cover up that land. I do love the story about the rancher that won $25 million in the lottery, and somebody asked him what he was going to do with it, and he thought a couple of minutes and he said, well, I reckon I'll just go on ranch until it's gone. You know, that is what you would end up doing if you were trying to put compost over a huge area. I mean, it's great in the home garden or whatever, but if you have a large area to cover, or if you simply don't want to go to the expense and effort of spreading a lot of compost, well, let me back up just a little bit. Compost does several different things. It brings in physical organic material and brings in a lot of energy in the form of carbon bonds in the compost. It creates a lot of carbon dioxide when you put it on the grass or on the ground, and this carbon dioxide is taken up by the plants. They don't have to, the stomata don't have to stay open as long, so they don't lose as much water. That's how compost reduces water use in your grass. And compost brings the microbial life in. With compost tea, we don't get the first two benefits, but compost tea is the best way that is known to put the microbial life back into the soil. So, in a nutshell, what we are doing when we make compost tea is to extract a bunch of the beneficial forms of life out of the compost, and then we're going to give them the opportunity to reproduce themselves many times over. Now, bacteria, you can have a new generation of bacteria every 7 or 8 minutes. I mean, they make rabbits look like things that reproduce slowly. And so you can imagine that given 24 or 48 hours, that's what we would call an exponential expansion of the amount of bacterial life in there. For every one little bacteria that was in there, or bacterium, whatever the correct English form is, you could have 1 million of them after literally just a few hours. So in making compost tea, we've got two things going on. We want to extract the microbes from the compost, and then we want to give them the opportunity to reproduce themselves many times over. When you put out a gallon of compost tea, you certainly don't have all the physical characteristics of a huge amount of compost, but as far as the life that is in the compost tea, you're probably getting as many microbes in a gallon of compost tea as you would get in 10 dump truck loads full of compost. So what it is just a very concentrated source of the beneficial things that existed in the compost that it is made from. So, if we want to make good compost tea, we have to start with good compost, and then we have to go through the process of extracting and brewing. Now, anybody that wants to, Bruce Dooley had told me he would bring one of his little compost buckets over here, but I guess he didn't make it in this week. He's adopting like 300 parrots, and somehow this is taking him a lot of time, but that's a whole other story. Listen to it this afternoon. I'm sure he'll tell that story 2 or 3 times. But a compost tea brewer can be something that's very simple and inexpensive, or it can be something that's pretty elaborate. If you're making big quantities, it will be pretty elaborate. The brewer that, well, Jeff's sitting out there by it right now, the brewer that we use costs a couple of $1,000s. But when we went to this seminar that Dr. Elaine Ingham gave, we did what was called a great tea-off. There were about 15 different people brought their different kinds of compost tea makers in, and one day of the seminar was dedicated to learning how to analyze a compost tea, and we took samples from all these machines and looked at them, and she showed us how to determine which one was the very best compost tea based on diversity of microorganisms and number of microorganisms. These machines ranged from Malcolm Beck brought his Worm Gold compost tea maker, which I think cost $12,000. On the other end of the scale, Bruce Dooley brought his 5-gallon tea bucket that cost about $30 to make. And there were every range in between. Most of them cost a few hundred, several of them cost several $1,000s. Okay, the number one best compost tea that was made out of these 15 machines was Malcolm's expensive compost tea maker. Number 2 was Bruce's tea bucket that cost 30 bucks. It did a better job than machines that cost literally thousands of dollars. We didn't take ours, by the way. So, but you don't have to have, the bottom line is, you don't have to have a super expensive machine in order to produce compost tea. Okay, so we want to make compost tea. How are we going to do it? Well, first of all, you need to have very good compost. We use the ladybug compost because it's the best bag compost we've been able to find. That stuff right there they call revitalizer. We have also used sometimes things like the product from New Earth because, again, it's got a lot of diversity in the microbes. If you've got a good compost pile at home, you may very well have all you need to make compost tea. But I want to differentiate between compost tea and compost leachate. And a lot of people use the terms interchangeably, and they're not. If you soaked compost in a bucket, the liquid that came off of it would be compost leachate. And that is merely some of the good things that dissolved out or swam out or whatever else out of the compost. And compost leachate is, again, a very good thing to make and pour over your plants. But once again, if you've got, how many, 5,000 pepper plants?
Not
Or,
quite that many.
okay, if you had thousands of pepper plants, or acres and acres to do, it's not practical to soak compost in a bucket and go pour the water out, even more than it is to cover the area with compost. So what we're going to do is extract the material. We're in fact going to make a compost leachate, but then we are going to make it reproduce itself many, many, many times over. Now, the first step in making this is the water that you put into the bucket. And we need to have water that is free of chemicals that would hurt the microbial life. When you drink city water, that water has been, quote, purified, and I guess we have to do that because there's a lot of bad stuff out there in the water that might go through the system. But unfortunately, it also kills out a lot of good things, and when you first get the water out of the tap, it's still full of chlorine. And we don't want to use water that is full of chlorine because, again, that chlorine was made to kill microbial life. We want it out of the water before we use it. So you've got several choices. You can collect and use rainwater, which is absolutely perfect. You can let your water sit out, you know, fill your buckets that you can make your compost tea and just let the water sit there for 2 or 3 days. And if your utility company or water provider is using chlorine as a disinfectant, all that chlorine will turn to a gas and go away. But what we do is we want to aerate the water. We're going to run a lot of bubbles through the water, and if we're doing this, then in about 15 minutes we can get rid of the chlorine to a point that we can start thinking about making our compost tea. Now, if your water supplier, and depends on, I think Saws uses exclusively chlorine, Bear Met in some of their systems uses a much more toxic and long-lasting product which is called chloramine, C-H-L-O-R-A-M-I-N-E. If you don't know, and if you're going to be using water out of the tap to make compost tea, call and ask if they use chloramine or if they use chlorine, because chlorine turns to a gas and goes away. Chloramine does not. It stays in the water for a long, long time, and just leaving the water standing out or aerating the water is not going to get rid of this material that was designed to kill the very thing that you're trying to stimulate. If your water comes from a system that uses chloramine, you go down to an aquarium shop, and you know those little drops you put in the water so it doesn't kill your fish? Put exactly the same thing into the water that you're going to use to make your compost tea, because that will take the chloramine, and by the way, it'll also take the chlorine out as well. You can always do that if you don't want to give it a whole 15 minutes extra. If you're in a big hurry, you're on an awfully tight schedule if you can't bubble your water for 15 minutes or so to get the chlorine out. But anyway, we want to start with good, clean water that doesn't have anything that's going to hurt. Yes, sir?
You know, well water, it doesn't have any chlorine in it, but
No.
it has a lot of minerals. Does that make any difference?
No, minerals don't bother it at all. Okay, so now we've got good water and we want to put our compost in the water, or we want to get the good stuff out of the compost. Now we don't really want to leave the compost in the water. We want to extract the microbes from it, and then we want to get rid of the compost. So we normally, in the case of our bigger machine, it's got a little cylinder that sits down in the middle of it, and then it has an air pump and it has a diaphragm on the bottom that releases a bunch of bubbles that come up. We have a second air line that goes down into the little hamper that holds the compost. It just has a little bubbler on the end of it. And man, we want to have that air turned up where there are lots of bubbles banging against, physically bumping this compost around to make the microbes let go of the compost particles and get out and into the water. Now, again, I'm sorry I don't have Bruce Dooley's bucket here, but I'll try as best I can to describe what he does. He takes a simple 5-gallon bucket. You can probably go down to a restaurant somewhere and get an empty pickle bucket. I mean, they ship and sell a lot of things in plastic 5-gallon buckets. I guess you could actually go to Home Depot or somewhere and get one of those orange buckets that they have. Free is better than $5 or whatever they charge for them. So if you've got a good source for them, great. If not, go buy one. To get air into that smaller bucket, you go to an aquarium shop and you buy a little air pump. Same thing you use in a fish tank that bubbles the air through the water so your fish stay alive. And as something to release the air, so to speak, they have what they call air stones. Everybody had an aquarium at some point in your life. You have the air pump and you run that little line over and plug it into the air stone and it makes a jillion little bubbles coming out. Well, in the case of your homemade bucket, that's what you need. You basically want 2 air lines and 2 stones though. You come out of your air pump, you put one of those little manifolds that you can then put 2 lines on it instead of just one, or more if you want to. But what you want to do is take a bag, and what we normally recommend is what they call a painter's or a paint straining bag. Go to any store that sells paint and they will have these, I guess they're made out of nylon, these bags that they pour the paint through to take all the lumps out of it. That's a great thing to put your compost in, and then you simply run one of these 2 air lines with this air stone down, and you put that down in the middle of this bag of compost and dunk the whole thing down in the water. Then you put your second air line down into the bottom of the bucket and just let it be oxygenating the water. Proper name for compost tea, by the way, is actively aerated compost tea, or AACT, I think is the initials that we use on it. But the first stage of making your compost tea involves simply getting the microbes out of the compost, and it's usually done either with an air stone or with just a bubbler that's stuck down into the compost. And in this initial brewing, or this initial breaking the compost free stage, is usually going to be somewhere between 4 and 6 hours. After you've run a lot of oxygen through there, after you bump this compost around for 4 to 6 hours, you've got most of the stuff out of there that's going to come out. So at that point, we take the bag of compost out, or we take the little cylinder out of the top of the tea maker. Matter of fact, let me see. Let me get that, show you just what it looks like. If you just 1 second. Would you bring me the thing that we put?
Hey, Bob,
Yes.
you said buy an air pump. They come in probably different volumes or whatever. What is recommended?
20 to 30.
You don't have to have a very big one for a 5-gallon bucket. You need a really big one if you're going to make a 25-gallon bath.
Yeah.
The same thing that would run, say, a 50-gallon fish tank would be plenty.
It needs 2 output lines.
Well, it needs come out of the air pump with 1 line, and then you can put a little manifold on there. Plugs in here, and then has 2 little lines that go out.
Right. On Bruce's plans, it's got
Yeah,
2.
it has the 2 lines. One to go into the bag of compost, the other to go down into the water underneath. See, this is the, if you're going to do just a simple bucket, that's a paint straining bag. About 85 cents or something like that. If you're doing like ours, 25 gallons at a time, that's what we put the compost in. It'll have a separate line that goes down in here, and the compost, or the microbes, simply come out through the screen on the sides. But then after this initial 4 to 6 hours of brewing, then we take whichever thing has been holding our compost out, and now we've just got our liquid in there and our microbes swimming around in there. Now, I guess one other thing that I should mention before you start, you want to decide if you're trying to brew just a special type of compost tea, or whether you want to just do kind of a broad spectrum where you have just a wide range of different things in it. The science has gotten specialized enough that they make what some people call designer compost teas, because these things, like I say, they can do a lot to suppress disease problems, for instance. And if you were to contract with Elaine's company and you say, you know, I've got this given crop and I'm really fighting phytophthora blight on it, or I'm growing watermelons and I've got, what's the disease that hits watermelons so badly? There would be special things that they could put in their compost tea maker that would create a larger volume of those specific things that would fight whatever the specific disease was. In general, if we want a compost tea that's high in bacteria, we'll put sugars of some sort in it. We'll probably put molasses in it, or we could put just about any form of sugar, because that's the energy source that bacteria use to reproduce themselves. If we want a larger amount of fungi in there, then we will put things in the water like one of the brands, oat bran or wheat bran, and we'll probably put a little bit of what we call fish hydrolysate in there. That is, in effect, a fish emulsion that's made through a cold press process, as opposed to heating it up and boiling the stuff out of it. That kills a lot of good life. But you can make a cold press material where you get a lot of different good things out of fish, which really support microbial growth. That's probably why fish stinks so bad if you leave it out for a little while. It's all those different things that are growing in there. So a lot of times you can add a little bit of what we call fish hydrolysate. You want to add a little bit of seaweed? Yeah, you get all sorts of great things out of seaweed. There is no really right or wrong thing. And people experiment with different things that they put into their compost teas. And then if you have a microscope and you know how to use it, you can analyze and look at what's coming out. And we experiment constantly, because what we're trying to do is brew a compost tea that just has a huge diversity of different things in it, which is going to be the best overall thing to do. We don't begin to try to get into brewing a tea that will combat a specific disease problem or something like that. So we're going to use a little bit of fish hydrolysate, we're going to use a little bit of seaweed, we're going to use a little bit of molasses. And then when we bought the machine, we also bought their own proprietary blend. They don't tell us what's in there. They just tell us that dump 2 scoops of this powder in there and it's very good for microbial life. I guess you could add a little bit of Medina Plus. That's going to have some good microbial stimulants in there. But anyway, use something in there to give the microbes the energy that they need to reproduce and to stay alive and flourish in that broth. Now remember, if we're dealing with bacteria, we started out with, well, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 different kinds of bacteria. Bacteria are very, very tiny. And if you start out with maybe 1 million each of 7,000 kinds of bacteria, you know, we're into numbers that only Carl Sagan could really appreciate. And now we're asking these things to double themselves every 7 minutes. You got to have a fair amount of nutrient there for them to do this. Now, the limiting factor in producing good quality compost tea is going to be providing them enough oxygen to stay alive, because we want what are called aerobic microbes in there. We want the guys that, well, it's not a good accurate way to put it, but we want the ones that breathe oxygen. We do not want the microbes that are what we call anaerobic, the kind of microbes that live without any oxygen. The kind of microbes that live without oxygen, you probably know what they are. One of them is called botulism. Another one's some of the bad forms of E. coli, salmonella. Yeah, there's some really nasty bacteria out there. Now, you're not likely to have these in your compost tea, even if it goes anaerobic. But what we want to do is always keep that tea so full of oxygen that these guys are living and thriving and healthy. In order to do that, we want to keep a lot of oxygen bubbling through there, but at the same time we don't want to overstimulate them. So we only put a small amount of molasses in there. Because you put a lot of molasses in there, you will get such a spike of bacteria that you can't bubble enough oxygen through there to keep those things alive and healthy. So we use a relatively small amount of stimulant. We put maybe, in our 25-gallon brewer, we might put a tablespoon of molasses in there.
Wow.
We might put 2 or 3 tablespoons of the fish hydrolysate in there. We might put maybe a cup of oatmeal or something like that, or oat bran actually, better than oatmeal. But you don't need a lot because, again, these microbes are used to living without a lot of nutrient material in there. And if you put too much in there, they will simply reproduce and grow faster than you can bubble oxygen through it, and it will go anaerobic simply because the amount of growth that you've got going on in your brewing tea. Does that make sense? Okay, so
You'd be looking about a quarter of a teaspoon for
yeah, for a
5-gallon
5-gallon bucket, you're looking at really very small amounts of these materials. Now, how long does it take to reach an optimum amount of microbial life? Somewhere between 12 and 24 hours, probably with a peak at about 16 to 18 hours. Compost tea, you're going to have good stuff in there after 6 hours. You're going to have plenty of good stuff in there after 48 hours. But much beyond that, they've used up the nutrients in there and their numbers start tapering off. It's not going anaerobic. It's not running out of oxygen, but it's running out of nutrients. And when you run out of food, when you have a metabolism rate that is that high, when you start running out of food, you either go into a dormant stage or you die off, one or the other. So ideally, we don't brew our tea for more than about 48 hours, and the perfect time to use it is probably after about 30 hours or so, about a day plus 6 hours, 24 to 36 hours. Get a fair amount of material after 18. So again, like most things in organics, it's not really an exact science. Now, the other thing is you understand the brewing process now. You understand that once you take it out of your brewer or out of our brewer, you're taking away the oxygen. And so it's not going to live a real long time. We always recommend that when you want to put out compost tea, that you get it put out within 2 to 4 hours of the time you get it. Don't put it in the car and leave it sit there all afternoon in the parking lot. You're not going to have much left after that length of time. If you're making your own compost tea, take it out of the bucket and use it. If you're getting our compost tea that we make on the weekends, take it home and use it. If you got a long shopping trip planned, don't get it till after you've done your shopping. Now, maybe if you live in Blanco or somewhere like that, and you say you want to come into San Antonio and get a bunch of compost tea and take it home, but that's going to take me a while. Well, then go to the trouble, go to a sporting goods store somewhere, and any fishermen in here? I'm sure there are plenty of fishermen in here. You know those little deals that you can get that you plug into your cigarette lighter and drop in your minnow bucket to keep your minnows alive by bubbling a lot, by putting a lot of oxygen in the water? Get one of those things. And simply plug that in and oxygenate your compost tea just like you'd oxygenate your bucket of minnows. You do that, you've got a lot of extra hours to play with. If you drive over roads as rough as some of mine, you probably don't have to worry about it because it does this and it shakes it up, and it would actually help to take that jug and just give it a good shake every now and then. But in general, unless you are continuing to provide oxygen, take your compost tea home and use it. The sooner you use it, the more life you will see in there.
Bob, can I ask you
Yes,
certainly. You were talking about adding the stuff to the compost tea. You always talk about using whole ground cornmeal for our tomato plant. Could you put some of that in that bag with the compost and it would do the same thing? It would put the beneficial fungi out?
Whole ground cornmeal grows one specific beneficial fungus called trichoderma. I can't remember the species on it. If you were making like a corn water tea that you were going to spray out specifically to control brown patch, yeah, you probably want to put some cornmeal into your blend. But things like oat bran and wheat bran and all, those things may support 50 different kinds of fungi or 500 different kinds rather than just one. So whole ground cornmeal, maybe a little bit, but I sure wouldn't overdo it with that because again, we want a lot of diversity, in the microbes that we are producing. Yeah.
For the audience at home, could you give a timeline from when you put the water down and aerate to when you pull out the bag and
Okay, we're gonna aerate the water for about 15 minutes to get the chlorine out, since that's what we're looking at right here at this spot in San Antonio. We're gonna leave the compost in there, breaking the microbes out of it for about 6 hours. And then we're gonna let the material sit there and brew for somewhere between 18 and 48 hours, with a peak of activity being probably 24 to 30 hours after we stop, or after we start. And then you simply want to take it home and use it as quickly as possible.
Rainwater, by the way, collected in the last 2 to 3 days is probably 40 degrees. Is there a optimum?
No, and that's a great question. There's not a problem with using cooler water. Ideally, you would like to be using water that is at the ambient temperature outside. As little as a 2-degree shift in temperature will activate one group of microorganisms and put another group of organisms so to sleep. As it warms up through the day, you're going to have peaks of different particular species of bacteria operating at any given time. If you want to use broad terms, we refer to 3 types of bacteria: psychrophilic, mesophilic, and thermophilic. Psychrophilic bacteria work when it is very cold. Thermophilic bacteria work when it is very hot, and we're talking, very high temperatures. Mesophilic bacteria operate kind of in the middle, and you can further subdivide that down with a jillion different species of bacteria. But you want to be putting out the bacteria that are going to be active at any given point, so you want your compost tea pretty much at the outside temperature. I don't recommend making compost tea inside a warm house and then go out and spraying it in a cold yard. You simply will derive more benefit if the tea is at about the same temperature as the air temperature. But no, rainwater we've collected over the past few days would be perfect to make compost tea in.
Bob?
Yeah.
Since, most of mine are vegetable plants like tomatoes, peppers, and squash, when you make your 5-gallon compost tea, what do you recommend per plant to pour? A cup per plant?
We'll get to that in just a second.
Bob,
Yes.
it says on here not to apply when the ground is dry, so this has to be handled a lot like beneficial nematodes would be?
Well, I'll talk about that in just a second. Okay. Now, you may see sold occasionally, if we find one that I really like, we will start carrying one here, but you may actually see a bottled material put on the shelf that says compost tea for sale. And you're thinking, well, that's a lot more than 2 hours old, how can that be compost tea? There are ways that you can do what they call stabilized compost teas. There are 3 ways to do it. You can treat your tea with phosphoric acid, you can treat it with concentrated molasses. I don't remember what the 3rd way is. And you will put a lot of the microbes into a state of what we might call suspended animation. Now, that only works for microbes that have a resting state, and not all have a dormant or resting state. When you try to stabilize your compost tea, you're going to kill off over half of the life that is in there. So it's not something that, we really are crazy about doing. But at the same time, if you kill off half the life that's in there, you still have more different forms of microbial life in that bottle than you get in some of the best inoculants that you buy out there. So find a bottle of stabilized compost tea. Is it bad stuff? No, but it is not nearly as good as freshly brewed compost tea. The other thing that I worry about too is, the compost tea that you've stabilized is no better than the tea was before it got stabilized. And at the same function up in Austin that I was telling you about, someone that I know very well, someone that makes some excellent compost products and other things, had this fancy, looked kind of like a Star Wars machine that he claimed was going to make some of the best compost tea ever. Well, when we got to looking at it under the microscope, it was almost totally devoid of life. He had a $2,000 machine that gave him nothing. I mean, it looked pretty, but just the process that he was using was not doing what a compost tea maker needed to make. And so we have looked at several so-called stabilized compost teas. I mean, my training years ago, back before I got smart and got back in the nursery business, I spent my time as a research biologist in a lab, in this case using an electron microscope. I learned a lot about using microscopes a long time ago. So we look at our compost tea every time we brew a batch. we'll get the microscope out and take a look at it and be sure that it is full of the right kind of things. When we have bought these so-called stabilized compost teas, look at them under the microscope, and some of them are absolutely full of one kind of bacteria, or maybe one kind of fungus. And to me, that's not what compost tea is all about. So we haven't found a stabilized tea that we like well enough, you know, to put it on the shelf as a stabilized compost tea. We still very, very much prefer the fresh brew. Yes, sir. Question?
You were talking about the same idea of making a tea that is appropriate for your immediate surroundings and the vegetation you have in your area. If you use something like a commercial compost, you're not going to have something that's specific to your area. So would it be better to mix that with what you have growing in your yard?
That would be an excellent thing to do. And that is a real good point. You want microbes from your area. This compost is made in Austin, and it has virtually the same thing that we have here. New Earth compost is made in right over on the east side of San Antonio. Matter of fact, I'm going to be broadcasting my radio show out there tomorrow morning. If you want to come out and see what New Earth looks like, Clayton's going to give tours. If you were going towards Seguin, if you're going out I-10 like you're going towards Seguin, about halfway between Loop 410 and Loop 1604, on the south side of the road, there's a great big water tower. New Earth's office sits almost underneath that water tower, and if you look up on the hill behind, you'll see acres and acres of compost production up there. For my money, and I've told you this before, I think New Earth makes the best bulk compost that you'll find in the area. I'd rate theirs first, I'd rate Fertile Garden Supply second, I'd rate Gardenville's, you know, a distant third. Since Malcolm's not making their compost anymore, it's just not the quality that it used to be. For a bagged compost, this is made up in Austin by John Dromgoole, and John has researched everything there is to know about compost and all. And for a bagged compost, that's the best we've ever found. When we make compost tea with this compost, we even frequently find live beneficial nematodes in there. Yes, sir.
How about New Earth's newer compost?
That's the one that I like that they make.
That's what
I do not like their biosolids compost. I'm not a fan of any biosolids products, I'm sorry. Sewage sludge, we have to call them biosolids because that's more palatable to people these days. But I just like the manure products better than I like the sludge products. There are just too many things that go into the sewer system, for lack of a better term. And it's not that I'm concerned about human excrement, but you would not believe the amount of not just chemicals but drugs that get flushed down the toilet. They've got so much Prozac in some lakes in Florida and also in North Texas that they feel like it's affecting the fish. Same thing with hormones of various sorts. They've got swamps in Florida that the alligators are really getting screwed up. You're getting 25 males for every one female. And it has to do with all this crud that's going down the sewer system, that's winding up in the treatment plants, that's winding up in the, quote, biosolids compost. And when you get biosolids compost, you're not getting, you know, pure waste. What you're getting is, my friend Jim Dursum that ran plants for saws for a long time, you're getting the microbes that ate the microbes that ate the microbes that ate the microbes that ate the waste. So it's not like it's a disgusting material, even though it doesn't have a real pleasant odor. I'm just concerned about all the other things that are in there in the forms of chemicals and drugs and perhaps heavy metals and things like that. But other people think there's nothing wrong with biosolids compost. Malcolm loves biosolids compost. That's his choice. I will not be putting Milorganite on my yard, and I will not be putting Alamo Grow compost on my yard. That choice is yours. I don't mind the manure compost, and I think they make excellent compost and excellent compost tea. But anyway, if you want a tour of a compost facility, Clayton said he's going to offer tours. And by the way, if you need bulk compost, if you need it by the truckload, I think he's saying 25% off the price on everything. Woke everybody up.
How about decomposed granite? Is that included?
I don't know if they have decayed granite out there or not. You can call and ask. But when we built our parking lot over here, and I'm going to get back to compost tea in just a minute, we used a bunch of different soils out there in our beds. The newer soil was by far the best. Gardenville soil turned to rock, fertile garden soil was somewhere in between. But I like their products. I'm not going to tell you they're 100% good. The load of soil that we got and put in our new beds out front when the city finally got through screwing up the street, I don't like the consistency of it nearly as much as I like the soil we got when we built the parking lot. But it's still better than we found anywhere else. Anyway, so, you know, come out if you want to see a big compost operation, if you want to see some very good compost. I'll be on the air from 8 till noon, including Dr. Kirby's show. Clayton was saying he's going to conduct tours as soon as I finish. He said as soon as your show's over. I don't know whether that means as soon as the garden show's over or if that means when the pet show's over. But you can call New Earth Soils and Compost and ask what time he's going to be giving the tours. And it would be a fun thing to do. And I'd love to get him over here. Maybe I will get him over here sometime to talk about actually making compost, because this guy knows the business. He's kind of like, I guess he's kind of like me. I learned a lot from Malcolm, and then I took what I learned from Malcolm Beck and expanded it many-fold over studying different things and learning from different people. Clayton got his start working for Malcolm Beck, and then he sort of went out and expanded his knowledge. Kenny Weir, that originally started Fertile Garden Supply, he passed away in an accident a few years ago. But Kenny started working for Malcolm, and then he went out and went his own direction with what he learned. John Drobgool up in Austin, he started out working for Malcolm and learned everything he could from Malcolm, and then went out and went his own direction. So just about everybody in the organics business in this part of the world either worked for Malcolm Beck or learned a lot from him to get started, and then went out and kind of specialized in their own given area. So anyway, I'll recommend New Earth to you. We recommend their products. If you're looking to buy stuff by the truckload, we'll send you to New Earth, or we'll send you to one of their suppliers. I buy their products, but I buy them from Stone and Soil Depot, because if I call Clayton and ask for delivery, it might be a week before I get it. If I call Jeff out at Stone and Soil, it's 10 in the morning, and he'll say, well, I can have it to you by 3 this afternoon. And normally, we want it to hurry when we want it. So, but anyway, I want to get back to Compost Tea in just a second. Yes, sir.
Can you go out there and get a pickup load?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm not sure the hours of the day. You'll have to ask him that. That's all we do. It is on I-10.
I think it's Foster Road. Actually.
Yeah, Foster Road exit.
Just past the big white landfill on the right.
Yeah. Yeah, just go like you're going toward 1604. Are the access roads two-way out there?
There's a lot of construction. Foster Road's really quick. If you're taking 410 and you spin around to go I-10 east, it's first exit.
Yeah. Just stay on the access road. You'll see New Earth on the right-hand
I
side.
was gonna say, there are two-way streets out there, so be
Yeah.
careful.
There's two-way frontage road.
Those frontage roads are real busy with those big trucks.
Anywhere in this town, be careful.
I would recommend you get you an easy loader, or whatever they call it, because you used to advertise it.
Oh, yeah.
That really works about a cubic yard and a half. It works great. 2 cubic yards, you
It's
need a lot of them.
deal, I think, costs about $100.
That's what it is. It was.
And the only place I knew that had them, or probably still do, is Fertile Garden Supply. It's a little deal you can put in the back of the truck, and basically, it's, I guess, maybe oversimplifying it, but it's like a tarp with a bar and a crank, you know, on each end. And this goes in the bed of your pickup truck, and they dump, you know, the compost or whatever else in there, and instead of shoveling it out, you simply do this, and it just pulls it all out and lays it on the ground.
Yeah.
Is that an oversimplification?
That's
Or,
it.
you know?
But it's only got a crank on the driver's side.
Okay.
The right side doesn't have one.
Okay.
And I was gonna tell him, you know what? Depending on when the wind is blowing so bad, you need to be on the other side of the truck, because the other day, that south wind at 30 miles an hour, it's just blowing on me.
Well, you should have turned the truck around the other way. There's a story in there about the Aggies were up nailing shingles on the side of the house and throwing about half of them
What's that
down.
noise?
No, this is, the guy's up there is up on the ladder, and he's throwing about half the nails down on the ground, and he asked him, he says, what are you doing? And he says, some idiot put the head on the wrong end of about half these nails. And his friend says, oh, are you ever stupid? Them nails go on the other side of the house. So anyway, turn your pickup truck around, then you'll be on the downwind side of the place you can do that. Anyway, so we've got our compost tea, we've got it brewed. How are we going to use it? You can pour it on, or you can spray it on. They even spray it out of airplanes. So to the question about how moist it needs to be, no, it doesn't have to be super wet. But in fact, everybody know what a pivot irrigator is? These things, I'm sure you've flown over and you look down and you see green circles on the ground. That is a big, long irrigation pipe with sprayers on the head of it that's anchored at a pivot point, and this thing goes around and around spraying water out, moving very slowly, spraying water, spraying fertilizer, whatever else they happen to be putting out. Dr. Ingham showed us a picture of somewhere in Australia where they had done an experiment putting compost tea on half of one of these pivot circles. On the half where they'd applied the compost tea, it's a solid mass of green growth, and I'm not even sure what the crop was. On the opposite side, where they hadn't used the compost tea, used the same fertilizer, same crop, same amount of water, but without the compost tea, it was about 40% bare soil and about 60% plant. And it was just night and day the difference. And she said, I wish we could tell you what the difference in actual harvest was from the two sides of this. She said, but we took the picture back and we showed it to the farmer that was doing this. So being a relatively smart farmer, what did he do? He immediately went and put compost tea on the other half and ended up with a good crop on both sides of it. But it can be put out in a sprayer, can be put out just pouring it on. They say ideally you're getting probably as much benefit from putting out a maximum of about 4 to 5 gallons per acre. That means a standard homeowner-sized lot, a gallon or at most 2 gallons, is probably all you need to cover a given area. Does it hurt to use it in a more concentrated form? Absolutely not. What is left over in our brewer at the end of the weekend either gets put on flower beds around here, or if I'm going to have time and I can put it out immediately, it gets loaded into my car, I take it home, and I just walk down the rows of my garden, pouring this compost tea out. Sure, that's highly concentrated, but when I leave here I'm tired, sometimes it's late at night, and obviously you can't leave it sitting around till the next day, so I just go out and dump it on anywhere I can dump it on. If I've got enough energy to walk down to the garden, that's where it goes. If it's a busy spring Sunday, it just gets poured in the flower beds around my house. So there is not really a right or a wrong way to put it out, but you can spread it pretty widely and still get great benefits from it. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at bare soil or whether you're looking at a lawn, whether you're looking at plants. If you are putting it on growing plants, probably dump it over the plant or spray it over the plant, because there are a lot of things in there that will actually colonize the stems and the leaves of the plants as well as the roots. But even if you have nothing growing there, even if my garden is empty, which it really never is, but there may be rows that I'm waiting to plant, like right now, waiting to plant my tomatoes. If we have compost tea left tomorrow, it'll go home and I'll pour a little bit of it in every one of those mounds that I've described to you, that I make, where I'm going to plant the individual tomatoes or peppers. So there's really not a right or wrong way, to put it out. Now, the question will always come up, well, if we're using city water, and we're putting it out with a sprayer of some sort, isn't that city water going to do some damage to the microbes in the compost tea? Yes, it will. You're going to kill off a portion of them, but if that's the only way you have to spray, then that's about all you can do. Better would be to take a pump-up sprayer of some sort and, again, use your rainwater that you've collected, or put some of those drops in your water, or have a couple of buckets of water sitting out that you've allowed the chlorine to outgas and get out of, and use your non-chlorinated water in your sprayer when you put it out. So there's more than one kind of sprayer too. There are the pump-up sprayers. There are what we call a trombone sprayer. I don't know if we have any in there now. We usually keep them, but you simply take a bucket, you drop the hose from the sprayer in, and it works by working it like a trombone. You can spray a long distance with those things and put out a lot of material in a hurry. So it would be better not to use a hose-in sprayer unless you happen to be on a well like some of us are, and there we don't have to put up with the chlorine and the fluoride and all these other things. Yeah.
So you're saying to dilute the compost tea when you apply it?
If you're gonna spread a gallon of it over, an acre of ground, or 5 acres of ground, no. If you're going to use 5 gallons per acre, obviously you've got to dilute it down. If you're going to use a gallon on your city lot, obviously you need to dilute it down to make it go that far. But it doesn't matter if you use it straight. But let me tell you, no matter how fine your sprayer is, you can't spread a gallon over a city lot. so you are going to probably have to dilute it to some extent. But, you know, if you're going to pour it over your garden, you can have, you know, 5 gallon buckets sitting out there that you've gotten the chlorine out of, and then you go around and pour 1/5 of your gallon at each one of those, and then go dump those buckets around, or, you know, put it in whatever kind of sprayer or whatever you have. Yes?
Would it be okay to use green fish pond water?
Absolutely. In fact, one person, Bruce Dooley, kind of was accused of cheating when we did the big compost tea off up there, because instead of using water out of the hose, he went over and dipped water out of their fish pond and used that as the basis for the water he put into his tea bucket.
Why
which
not?
Might have had something to do with why he had such good compost tea. Yeah, and that brings up an interesting point too, and again, I just love to experiment and try different things. I was visiting with Bert Nichols that owns Water Garden Gems, and he was saying there's some research out there now that people that are using water out of fish ponds, that it is just amazing the difference they get in the growth of the plants that they put it on. Totally out of proportion to anything that's in the fish water. I mean, analyze the nitrogen, phosphates, things like that in there, and you're not going to have enough to make a big difference, but you know, you get double the growth by adding 1% more material. There's apparently something magic in fish pond water. So yeah, that would be a great thing to use as long as it doesn't clog up your sprayer. Okay, what else do I want to tell you? Yes?
Can you use like pantyhose or something like that for your sock?
Absolutely. It's not, as long as it's not just super, super fine mesh, because you want these little things to move through it fairly evenly. If it is a real fine mesh pantyhose, your bacteria will go right through it. Your fungal spores will probably go right through it. Even something like this, no, beneficial nematodes could actually go through that. But you know, you can hold that up. Look at the mesh on that. I wouldn't want something that was a whole lot tighter weave than that.
About how many times will that bag work before it, you know, or last, you know what I'm saying, to use? Because if I go to a paint shop, do I need to buy 4 or 5 of them?
Probably so. It's probably going to go 5 or 6 times. But if you're like us, it only takes one slip to rip a hole in it. And yeah, it'll go several times if you handle it carefully. Usually we're in a hurry, and I suspect the guys get maybe 3 uses out of it. But 60, 70 cents,
yeah,
you know, it's not the end of the world. Yes?
How much compost do you use for 5 gallons?
That's an excellent question. For 5 gallons, probably a couple of cups at most. For, you know, our 25 gallons, we'll fill this up to about that point. So, you know, a cup, cup and a half, 2 cups. Again, you're not going to leave it in there, so it doesn't really matter if you use a little bit of extra.
Is there any way to tell the whole thing as to whether you're getting good compost tea? I know y'all got a big old microscope.
Well, I guess for, you know, the best test is how are the plants doing. But as we get into a not quite so busy season, we'll pick a Saturday or Sunday or something for those of y'all that want to make your compost tea and say, hey, bring some over. We'll stick it on the microscope and see what it looks like. What I hope to do, and I'd hoped to do it before today, but just it's been busy, is to get what Malcolm Beck has, and that is a little camera that we can put in one of the eyepieces of the microscope and then project that on a television screen. Maybe I'll get Malcolm to do one of the seminars that we used to do, and I'll get him to bring his setup, because you know he's got a big screen TV, and he sets up the microscope, and you're looking through half the microscope over here, finding the different things underneath there, and over here on the TV screen, this is what Elaine Ingham did when we took the course. She would be looking, moving the field around and showing us different things, but since we couldn't all be looking through her microscope, we were actually watching it on a TV screen over here. And Analytical Scientifics is supposed to be getting us a camera that we can use, in our microscope. Any kind of microscope, will give you, you can see some things with it. If you get real serious about this, you'll spend $1,000 to get a good microscope. But maybe some of y'all work in the medical field or something like that, and you can sneak a little vial of stuff into the lab and take a look at it yourself. And yes, ma'am.
2 questions. Dr. Ingham?
Ingham. Uh-huh.
Does she have a website?
Soilfoodweb.com.
And the second one, you were talking way back in the beginning about leachate versus tea.
Uh-huh.
Is the leachate actually not a beneficial thing to do, or you said it was basically a matter of space and...
Well, it's a matter of concentration. Leachate is good stuff, there's no question about it. But if you counted microbes, you probably would have 10,000 times as many microbes in tea as you would in leachate. But you bring up a real good point. Some things reproduce very, very quickly. Other things reproduce very, very slowly. Your bacteria, you may have 10,000 times as many. Your fungi reproduce much, much more slowly. You're going to have more fungal spores and more fungal filaments in your compost tea than you had in the compost. But it's not going to be as huge an increase as you will see in bacteria. Yes?
Since I got my degree in accounting and not biology, when I look under there, how would I know what's good or what's bad?
That's a good question. You could pay $500 a piece like we did and go take Elaine's course. Or, she does have some simple pamphlets out. I'm not sure, it's been a while since I looked at her website. She may have some information on there, but Fertile Garden Supply is the one place I know that at least at one time was carrying her manuals that actually have pictures of how to tell good fungus from bad fungus, to know what some of the different types of protozoans are. Most of the bacteria you see are going to be good bacteria. In an aerobic situation, the bacteria you get are going to be good. Anaerobic, it's a whole different story, but it's just, I just can't state enough how important it is that we have good bacteria in our lives. If you didn't have good bacteria in your intestinal tract, you couldn't live. I mean, your intestine couldn't process your food. Your skin is covered many layers deep. You take a scraping off your skin and look at the bacteria that are in there, it would be an incredible number. And those bacteria are protecting you from a lot of different things. So you get these idiots out there that create their wonderful antimicrobial soaps. We're going to have these antimicrobial soaps that kill all the bacteria. Well, sure, it may kill, I mean, if you're living in a daycare or a day school or something like that, and you got 50 sick kids running around, yeah, I might wash my hands with antimicrobial soap. But in the daily world, you're doing yourself a real injustice killing off the good stuff that's living on your skin in the name of killing off a few bad guys. Just one other thing that I'll say in that regard, I should have mentioned at the beginning, sometimes when you're bubbling all this water through your tea, you may get a little bit of foaming. If you want to cut down on the foaming, you can put a little bit of vegetable oil in there. Do not put olive oil in there. Olive oil is antimicrobial. You might think of putting honey in place of sugar in. Don't do that. Have you ever noticed you can leave honey sitting out on the table for weeks and it may crystallize, but you never get mold growing on it? Honey is antimicrobial. And remember, we don't want to put anything antimicrobial into our compost tea. So no olive oils, and I think that tells you that in your handout, but that's why it tells you not to do that, because those products are naturally antimicrobial. Yes?
How do you clean your compost tea bucket?
Now that is a real good question, because if you don't clean your compost tea maker well in between times, you can get what are called biofilms built up, and these may contain some bad guys that you really don't want to reproduce. Generally, just a good scrubbing with water is all you need. If in doubt, use a little bit of hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide is probably the safest antibacterial material out there, which leaves no residue behind. Whatever you do, don't use Clorox. In fact, don't use Clorox for anything. Clorox used to be a reasonably good disinfecting agent. In fact, it's what all the vets use to disinfect, in the clinics and things like that. But then they made new, improved Clorox, and they put sodium hydroxide in there, and you simply can't wash that stuff off. Once you get it out, it is hard to get rid of. But hydrogen peroxide is a good thing for cleaning, where you want a very temporary antimicrobial action, and but you don't want any of the residue left behind. But it is important to clean your tea bucket between times. It is important to clean your air stones between times. A bag like that, it's not going to last long enough to worry much about biofilm built up on there, so I don't worry about cleaning the bag. But it is important, we do take that little and you're welcome to go over and look in the tea maker over there if you like. You just see a world of bubbles coming up through it, and it's got a special disc in the bottom. I don't know what it's made out of, something very expensive obviously. And again, if you want to buy compost tea, we brew it fresh every weekend, Saturday and Sunday until we run out. We have compost tea here. I think we sell it for $5.50 a gallon or something like that. It doesn't cost that much to make compost tea. When you got a $2,000 machine, it's kind of like, doesn't use, when you get an x-ray, doesn't use very much electricity to take an x-ray. But if you're over at Dan Kirby's clinic and you've got a $125,000 x-ray machine, you got to recoup that cost over time. And that's why we charge for compost tea, otherwise we'd give it away. Yes?
How often would you recommend using it?
That's another good question. If we had a real bad drought like this, I would use it 2 or 3 times over the next month or two, because I really think the dry weather has probably been damaging to the microbial life. Can you put it on dry soils? Sure. But if you have it in a film of water, it disperses through the soil much, much better. That's why it is better to put it on in times of high moisture, or else to water the yard before you put it on. If you have a neighbor who is dealing with the idiots in the pest control business, we won't mention Kim Lawn by name, but some of the ones out there, I mean, their operators are so stupid they can't read house numbers. And one of the girls that used to work for us, the neighbor across the street contracted them to come out and spray all the weed killers and, you know, flea killers and everything else all over their yard. Well, the idiots didn't spray the yard they were supposed to. They sprayed her yard instead. And she's very organic, and you can imagine the problems there. Something like that happens, I'd spray with compost tea probably once a week for the next couple of months, because that's another thing your microbes do, is break down the toxic materials that are in the soil. I mean, the best toxic cleanups that are out there these days are based on microbes, not based on chemicals. And I mean, they've got microbes that eat lead, they've got microbes that eat uranium, they've got microbes that eat oil. Our friends in Medina sent them back in the big Valdez oil spill up in Alaska. One of the more successful products they used were some of the materials that the microbes that literally ate the oil up, rather than trying to contain it or dissolve it or anything else. But microbes are some of the best anti-pollution tools that we have. So you're moving into a new house, you don't know what the previous owner sprayed or dumped on the yard, and spray with compost tea once a week for several weeks, and you'll have a much, much cleaner yard. You have the misfortune of getting a parvo puppy. I talked to my friends up at Bergman's. They've got Cocker Spaniel puppies now, and one of the people that was going to adopt one of them said, well, now, you know, we got another puppy 3 months ago, and it turned out to have parvo, and we only had it for about 12 hours, but you know, you need to do some serious things to sterilize your home to get rid of things like that. Compost tea is one of the best things you can spray around the yard to get rid of disease organisms as well as chemicals of all sorts. So how often do you use it? I think any yard would benefit from using it 2 or 3 times a year. But if you have serious problems, if you've had serious disease problems on your plants, in your vegetable garden, I'd use it more often than that, because I'm planting something or pulling something up fairly often, and I'll plant my tomatoes maybe this week if the weather looks like it's going to hold. Probably going to wait a couple of weeks to plant my eggplants and pepper, and I'll wait a couple more weeks before I plant my okra, because it's a real hot weather crop. And so obviously I will be, you know, spraying over a period of time, because I want to protect all the plants. And it's amazing what it does. Let me get you a yes. Again, that is a great question. Some things are very fragile. We talked a little bit about mycorrhizal fungi. You can actually get mycorrhizal fungal spores. We've got a new source. We'll be getting them sometime in the next week or so. Our original source, the lady went off to doing other things. But you would put these right at the end of the brewing process, because they're very fragile. They germinate, then they get busted up when you put them out. Beneficial nematodes will drown, and so I would not put it in while you're doing the brewing. But if when you get ready to spray your compost tea out, you want to put your beneficial nematodes in there and do it all in one operation, that's just fine. But don't leave them in there for 30 minutes, because even that period of time could drown your beneficial nematodes. And I should mention, we use the term beneficial nematodes pretty loosely. In the nematode world, there are like 500,000 different kinds of nematodes. Some of the nematodes are dangerous, damaging. Some of them cause diseases in plants. Some of them cause, serious problems in people. Some of them are just parasites of horse guts and things like that. Very small number, less than 5% of those. There are a number of them which we consider beneficial because they attack things like fleas and wireworms and grubworms and things like that. And then there are a lot of them that are just benign. They don't really seem to have any positive or negative effects. So of the beneficial nematodes that are out there, there are probably 25,000, 30,000 species of beneficial nematodes. The beneficial nematodes that you buy to put out to control grubs, things like that, I think there's 7 different species of nematodes in there which specifically target grubs and fleas and the things that we're trying to get rid of. When we use this compost to make compost tea and we find beneficial nematodes in there, I have no idea what they are. They probably are just benign guys that live in the soil and gradually decompose the compost. But it's hard to say. I can't imagine anybody who specializes. There was a lady back in my days, graduate school, that had identified, I think, over 100,000 different kinds of nematodes and literally wrote the book on nematodes. Not how I plan to spend my life, thank you. So I just know a little bit about the good ones, a little bit about the bad ones. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things that I keep reading and that we don't incorporate into our compost pile is manure.
Mm-hmm.
Is it critical? Because I keep seeing it over and over. Add manure. Are we missing something by not having manure in our compost?
Again, the microbes that decompose what is in most manures, you're missing a sort of category of microbes that you would be getting if you were adding manure. On the other hand, depending on what the animal was eating or what kind of drugs it was on, you could be introducing things that you don't want. So it's strictly up to you. A lot of people use their compost pile as a convenient way of disposing of pet waste. The people out at New Earth, and again, you may not want to think about it, but everybody wants to think that, good old red meat was made in a factory somewhere and then put in that package and sold at the grocery store. No, meat comes from slaughterhouses. What do they do when they kill a cow and its stomach and its intestine are full of half-digested food? They call that gut trash. And that's one of or paunch manure is another name for it. That's one of the things that ends up in a lot of the real good compost mixes around here. You really don't want to know what all goes into the compost. So you probably are not missing out on any large amount of things, but manure just happens to be one of the sources of microbes that gives you just a whole different class of microbes in there. Yes, sir?
We're on the subject. What about prions?
Nobody knows very much about prions, which of course are in effect a different life form, and things that cause mad cow disease. BSE, what is it? Bovine spongiform encephalopathy or whatever. It is very unlikely to be a problem, but nobody really knows. I think in most cases they have determined that the animals that get this disease, whichever name you want to, what is it, Crutchfield, Jacobi syndrome or something in humans, it's from animals that have eaten other than their normal food stuff. When they're feeding animals that are normally vegetarian, so to speak, and they start feeding them animal byproducts, that's when somehow we get, the growth of these prions, when we get the mad cow disease or whatever. But I don't think anybody really knows, but the chances of your encountering that in today's world are very, very low.
So I came across something in Europe where they're trying to ban blood and bone meal because they claim there's a link to prions getting into food supply that way. It sounds like overreaction.
It sounds like overreaction. Is mainly bone meal, because they think somehow, and prion science is a whole, it's a whole field of study that is very, very unrealized, and apparently you and I can ingest these things and they cause us no problem whatsoever unless there's some specific trigger in our body that allows these things to become active and eat your brain in effect. So nobody really understands them completely, and I agree with you. I think it's a great deal of overreaction.
Chicken Little's running around.
Oh, there are plenty of Chicken Littles. Yes, ma'am.
How can you test to see if your barnyard manure is contaminated with any of the pesticides, whether it's on Compost Tea?
Okay. The product that we are worried about is something they call a sulfonated ureal herbicide, picloram, sold under names like P plus D and things like that. It is the one substance out there that nothing is known to decompose. I mean, pesticides, there are microbes out there that destroy them. You know, insecticides, fungicides, there's something out there that destroys these things. But your picloram type herbicide, they don't know of any microbe out there yet that will break that thing down and get rid of it. So our concern is the farmer sprayed this on his hay crop because it kills everything except grass. The animal ate the hay. The herbicide came out on the manure, and we're concerned about that manure then killing everything except the grass. If you have manure and you want to test to see if it has picloram in there, I guess you could pay for a real expensive lab test, but the easiest thing to do is to put a bunch of manure in a bucket, fill it halfway full with water, and let it sit for a day or two. And what we're going to do is make, some people call it manure tea, but again, now that you've learned the right words, you'd really call it manure leachate. We're going to take the manure leachate and we're going to go find a dandelion or a tomato plant or some broadleaf plant. We're going to dump that manure leachate on it, and we're going to watch that plant for 2 days. If that manure had picloram in it, that weed's going to die. If the weed continues to grow and thrive, your manure's clean and certainly can be used.
Does it have to be a certain temperature or?
Not really, not really. But don't pour it on grass, because that's the one plant that picloram doesn't hurt. That's the whole idea behind spraying. It kills everything except the grass. And if you're buying hay and you're worried about that, either know the hay producer you're buying from, or if you can afford it, buy alfalfa. Alfalfa is not a grass. Alfalfa is a legume, and picloram would kill alfalfa, so obviously you don't spray that on there. But that's how you test to see if it's, you know, if it has problem in it. Yes, ma'am.
Would reverse osmosis water take the chlorine out?
I believe it does.
It'll be okay to use that?
Yeah. I'm not sure about chloramine. Does anybody else know? RO take chloramine out of it? I suspect it does, but you know, you can buy a bottle of fish aquarium drops real cheaply. I just use that to be on the safe side if your water supplier uses chlorine. I think that's pretty much covered what I wanted to talk about. A short lesson about compost tea. It is, for the money, it's one of the best things that you can do to spray on plants to improve your soil. If you've already got great soil, if you've already got a highly organic garden, you're not going to improve your soil very much. You may improve the plants. You'll improve the health of the plant spraying it on your plant. But if you've got great garden soil out there, don't spend your money buying compost tea to dump on the dirt, because you've already got everything it has in it.
You don't live in South Texas.
Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth?
One question about
Yes.
aeration. This will help aerate the soil to some degree.
It will. Believe it or not, the thing that creates the largest amount of organic material in the soil is not plant roots, tree roots, things like that, it's bacteria. Because of the rate at which they reproduce, they are actually building more of what we call biomass than anything else. As they do so, they create compounds which we refer to as flocculating the soil, which fluffs it up, so to speak, helps it absorb water, keeps it from compacting. Yes, compost tea will do a great deal to soften hard soils and to keep them loose and open. Now, let's think about, you know, what we have to do to keep the microbes alive after we put them on the soil. You know, we talked about putting the molasses and things like that into the water to help them reduce themselves. If you really want to do things to improve your soil, use some organic fertilizers, use some molasses, either liquid or dry. The things that we do that help improve the soil to begin with, we're just doing that to support the microbes that are already out there. And if you were to do that, if you were to spray some molasses around and then spray your compost tea on top of it, yeah, you would see increased results. If you put your compost tea out today and you go out and spray a little bit of molasses every 3 or 4 weeks afterwards, yeah, you're going to see much faster results. Trying to make your compost get ready faster? Go drench the compost pile with compost tea and then throw in a substrate that has a lot of energy in it to increase the bacterial activity. To increase the fungal activity, dump some wheat bran or some, oat bran, something like that out there. Continue to support the microbes after you've applied them to the garden. As if you listen to me, one of the things that I always really promote is spraying your plants with the liquid seaweed and molasses mix, because that it just stops spider mites totally. And if you're doing that, what else are you doing? You're putting out a lot of molasses. It's supporting the microbes that are on the leaves of the plant. I've found the most unusual thing I discovered 2 years ago, and since that time I've been kind of watching for it. My tomato plants were, as they usually are, up about this high. And I was walking down the road one day and I saw 3 or 4 big tomato hornworms that were dying of BT poisoning. And if you know what to look for, it's pretty obvious when a worm's dying of BT poisoning. Funny thing was, I hadn't sprayed any BT. What apparently was happening is there was enough naturally occurring BT in the environment that when I started spraying the molasses on the leaves of my plants, all of a sudden I was stimulating enough of the existing environmental bacteria that those numbers had gotten up to a point that they were now killing the damaging caterpillars. A lot of, and this is why Howard Garrett and I both try to convince people, don't be just a little bit organic. I mean, there are people out there that say, oh, I'm going to be organic, I'm not going to use any malathion, but I'm going to go dump chemical fertilizer on my yard. You just undid half of what you're trying to do. It's, what is the old joke? You can't be just a little pregnant. Either you are or you aren't. Don't be just a little organic. Be, go all the way, because there are a lot of different things like this that there's a great deal of interaction going on between what you do. And if you're not careful, you can undo 90% of the good stuff you did with, 10% of spraying the wrong stuff or using the chemical fertilizer just because you found it in the garage. And like I say, by spraying the molasses out there, I was activating a lot of good stuff out there that I didn't even know was there to begin with. So it's just one of the things that makes gardening fun. Trying to interpret what you're seeing is the big challenge. And sometimes it's just baffling. Sometimes why things are doing poorly, more often you look at something that's just growing fantastically well, and you think, now what on earth did I do? So can I reproduce that? Can I do it again? It's part of the fun of it. It's why I encourage you to take good notes. Keep a record of when you spray. I've told you before, out in that garden, go buy an old rural mailbox, the same thing I get my mail out of out on the road every evening. I've got a second one in my garden. I sunk a post in the ground, put this thing on top of it, and in that thing you'll find my pruners, my gloves, my journal. Make a note when you spray your seaweed molasses, because all of a sudden you realize, man, last week I really had a jump in growth. My friend Don Pylant used to be with the Botanical Gardens, now he's with the County Park System. When I first told him about seaweed, and he grudgingly tried it, he didn't believe anything would happen. He sprayed his garden with it and went on vacation for a week. And he came back and it's like he'd been in a time warp. He said, I got more growth in a week than I usually get in 2 months. Just keep up with what you're doing so that when you have either very good or very bad results, that maybe you can go back and see what caused one or the other of those and either repeat it or avoid it, as the case may be. Other questions? Mr. over here, yes ma'am.
I just wondered about brown patch. With the use of cornmeal, would it help to apply the other tea as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, trichoderma is not the only thing that stops brown patch. As a matter of fact, we talk about BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. There's a different bacillus called Bacillus subtilis, S-U-B-T-I-L-I-S, that is very effective against brown patch. You're probably going to get some of those in your compost teas. Yes?
Malcolm used to sell a micro for compost. How long do those last, and how much do you put in a compost?
Those are dry microbes, so to speak, that have a resting state. So they're probably good for 2 or 3 years. How much in a compost pile? Depends on how big your compost pile is, probably a cup or two.
Some of his
Yeah.
cages.
Yeah. You could dump the entire thing in there and you wouldn't hurt anything but your wallet, but probably a cup or two would give you the results you're looking for.
How much oat or wheat bran would you put in a 5-gallon bucket, and is it just stuff that you buy?
A couple of tablespoons, and yeah, stuff you get at the grocery store is fine.
Thank you.
Thank you. You are certainly welcome. You got it. Yes.
That rural mailbox has just got the right arc to use it for a hose reel too. When it once big in the backyard,